Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sociology Honors Seminar, Research on Gender. Let's begin with Mackenzie, who will be presenting Breaking Barriers, Exploring Female Athletes in the Age of Social Media.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? All good? Amazing. Amazing. All right. Yes. So as Myra said, my project is entitled Breaking Barriers, Female Athletes in the Age of Social Media. And to start, let's talk about the U.S. Women's National Team. In 2019, the U.S. Women's National Team won their fourth straight World Cup title, cementing themselves as probably one of the best female sports teams in the world at that time. Though after that win, they filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Soccer Federation over a gender pay gap that they are experiencing. And the pay gap that they had was where the men would earn close to $10,000 for a win, $5,000 for a loss, whereas the women would make $5,200 for a win and nothing for a loss, showing that they only made $250 more for winning than the men did for losing, even when they're an extremely higher level sport team than the men's team. So why is this happening? Why are some of the most talented athletes in the world still having to fight for proper compensation? To better understand the situation, let's look at the history of women in athletics, the experiences of female athletes, as well as how these situations translate to modern online spaces. So to start, Title IX was passed in 1972, initially to ensure that financial aid given to athletes reflected the number of men and women in society at that time. In the 1980s, it was applied to all educational programs, not just those who received federal funding. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, there were lawsuits surrounding Title IX that forced colleges and universities to strictly follow Title IX guidelines, allowing more opportunities for female athletes at the collegiate level. In terms of media coverage of female athletes, much of the time televised sports are of male athletics. And when female athletes are brought into the conversation and are able to be televised, much of the time, these televised events reinforce gendered stereotypes about women. Often female athletes are viewed as inherently weak or fragile compared to their male counterparts, and they're often infantilized by commentators through the use of phrases such as young ladies. Often the female athletic events that are highlighted are ones that highlight the female athlete's beauty, such as figure skating or gymnastics. As a whole, female athletes are discriminated against because they are within an inherently male sphere. Though female athletes who hold marginalized identities, such as queer athletes or athletes of color, often face further repercussions that should be discussed. Just as a female athlete, many athlete sexualities is under immediate scrutiny because they do perform within this male sphere, which often causes what is called homohysteria among female sports teams, where heterosexual female athletes are fearful of their potentially gay teammates, and they often become hostile towards them through the use of slurs. As well, these heterosexual female athletes also make sure they appear hyperfeminine in public or when talking with media to thus further themselves from their gay teammates. In terms of Black female athletes, much of the initial scrutiny that white female athletes face, Black female athletes don't, because our societal assumptions of female in athletics are based in whiteness. This is not to say that Black female athletes do not face discrimination, though. Much of the time, they're forced to overperform academically and strictly follow rules, especially at the collegiate level, because they're believed to not be able to perform well outside of athletics. Black female athletes are also seen as brash and hypermasculine, as well as animal-like, often that relates back to traditional racialized hierarchies that are rooted in the history of slavery in our country. In terms of politics and online behaviors, social media played a large role in the 2016 election and the subsequent election of Donald Trump. And much of that election was fueled by negative partisanship online, where individuals would play into political polarization and reinforce their own political biases rather than listening to the other side of the argument. In tandem with highly partisan media and misinformation, many conservative individuals started to use social media as a safe space where their anonymity would be implemented, and they could also find support from other like-minded conservative individuals, essentially making social media an echo chamber for conservative ideologies that were inherently racist, sexist, homophobic, and overall hateful. Seeing as much of this conservative-minded rhetoric made its way to all spaces of the internet, it also made its way to sports news outlets, obviously. And seeing as female athletes are not the dominant identity group, meaning that male athletes are, much of this hateful rhetoric was aimed towards them. So because of the history in the emerging discrimination towards female athletes, I'm asking, are female athletes proportionally represented on social media? And how is prejudicial discourse perpetuated through social media? In order to study this, in order to study this, I looked at the three main mainstream sports news networks, which were ESPN, Bleacher Report, and Sports Illustrated. I looked at all their tweets for 2020 so I could get a snapshot of every season and every sport, so nothing would be left out. And then I counted the number of tweets about female athletes from each account, and then analyzed the replies to those tweets in order to gain a better understanding of society's feelings towards female athletes. So what I found based on the data is that less than 3% of the time on each one of the different Twitter accounts, female athletes were talked about or tweeted about. On average, they were tweeted about 2.64% of the time, showing that there is massive, massive inequality in the representation of female athletes, especially on social media. So what I found was that while many of the replies to tweets about female athletes were positive, there were many of them that were extremely hateful and harmful in nature that came from those conservative-minded individuals who used that anonymity and their support from their community to publicly post these things online. And much of this ties back to the idea of the social desirability of those ideologies. So these individuals may not say these hurtful and racist and homophobic ideologies in public because they don't have the community. When it comes to online and they do have that community, they feel that they can continue this prejudicial rhetoric, and it tends to fuel that rhetoric as well. So mainly what I found was sexism and racism were two of the most highly used forms of hate speech. And as you can see on the left side of the screen in that screenshot, much of the sexism towards female athletes was solely just on the basis of them being women. These individuals saw no value in female athletics or the game because they believed that men were inherently more talented and thus more interesting to watch. And much of this comes back to gendered norms that individuals grew up being socialized with. And many, if not all of the sexist replies were made by men. And because of that, one can argue that these replies were made in an attempt to shame female athletes because they did not fit into that individual's idea of what a woman is or what femininity is. Many men do this in order to reinforce their own masculinity and to prove to others around them that they are also masculine. Sadly, I couldn't include it in the slideshow, but many of these tweets also included the infamous "make me a sandwich" phrase, which often is used by men to force women back into a role of subservience, otherwise known as like the cult of domesticity. And oftentimes this happens when men feel insecure or feel as if their masculinity is attacked, especially because they know within themselves that that female athlete is inherently more talented than them. Many of the racist replies that I found were exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, where many athletes took to social media and publicly demonstrated their condemnation of racism in this country. And as you can see on the right, Naomi Osaka was at the forefront of this, where she used her platform to talk about race and racism, which did happen to anger conservative-minded individuals who replied to these tweets because they believed that sports was not the forum to talk about politics, even though a majority of the athletes that they gain entertainment from are people of color, and these issues are affecting them personally. And this almost ties back to the idea of athletics as a form of New Age slavery, where athletes of color are used as forms of entertainment for white people and are even often traded between teams through their white owners, showing that the rhetoric of slavery is still extremely prominent in our society. One unique hurdle that is important to mention about Black female athletes is they often face what is called double discrimination, where they're discriminated against for being a person of color as well as being a woman, and that discrimination is compounded, making their criticism even harsher. What I also found was homophobia and transphobia were often very present in these replies because athletics is an inherently masculine activity. many individuals believe that these athletes are also inherently masculine and also participate in inherently masculine activities, such as being attracted to women. In terms of transphobia, there is little to no coverage of trans female athletes in society. And when there is, they face harsh, and intense forms of criticism, as you can see on the tweet on the far right. Most of the time, these trans female athletes are seen as confused men, or men who feel as if they couldn't compete at the same level as other men and thus decided to compete against women. And it's these types of tweets that are damaging and hurtful to trans female athletes that just further push them deeper out of the mainstream, and allows for transphobia to continue within the athletic sphere. Other forms of transphobic tweets that I found were often individuals assuming that a female athlete is so successful that they must secretly be a man in some way. This goes back and reinforces the fact that traditionally in our society, female athletes and women in general are seen as fragile and weak, and that they have nowhere near the same abilities as men. What I also found was what I called the girl boss narrative. Many of these individuals who made tweets like this were supportive and had good intentions behind their tweets and wanted to support female athletes, but they did so in a way that promoted the female athlete's maternal and feminine qualities rather than supporting the female athlete for their athletic abilities. What I also found was what I called faux representation, where mainstream news outlets are allowing female athletes into the mainstream by allowing them to do interviews or use their quotes, but almost as if they are props for male athletes. So if you look at the tweet in the middle, you can see Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe, two very prominent female athletes, are able to be on ESPN. They're able to talk and have a voice, but it's only when they're talking in context of a male athlete. And in this case, it's Jimmy Butler from the Miami Heat. And this just further places female athletes in a harmful subordinate position to male athletes, even though these mainstream news media outlets feel as if they are doing right. So in conclusion, we can see that the volume of attention that sports media offers women is extremely low. I mean, less than 3% of the time they're being tweeted about. And that's only causing prejudicial discourse to increase and become greater and greater. And it shows that the issues of gender equality within the athletic sphere are still extremely, extremely prevalent and need to be worked on. And I would love to be able to look at this research on different types of social media platforms, such as Instagram or TikTok, to see if the app's target audience would then affect the types of replies about female athletes. In closing, please, please, please support female athletes. They deserve so much more praise, recognition, and attention for all the hard work and effort that they put in their respective sports. And they just simply deserve better. Thank you.
That was a great presentation, Mackenzie. Wonderful analysis of sexism and racism in sports, and how it may intersect with sexualities and politics, on top of the cultural underrepresentation of female athletes. One thing that I failed to mention earlier was that if attendees had any questions, please post them in the Q&A at the bottom, and then we'll get to those once everybody has presented. So next, let's go to Danielle, who is presenting how hookup culture at the University of Oregon has changed in response to COVID-19.
Hello, I'm Danielle. Unfortunately, I do not have a whole presentation like Mackenzie. I just have one slide, but it's just a few excerpts of some quotes from interviews with participants. And yeah, okay. So in my project, I will be discussing how student perspectives during hooking up during the coronavirus pandemic have changed and what that currently looks like. So the coronavirus pandemic is something that is all too familiar to most of us. Since March of 2020, the world has changed as we all experienced going through some of the most unprecedented and trying times. Life seemingly came to a halt as suddenly we were working from home, standing 6 feet apart from strangers, and taking preventative measures to protect ourselves and others from the coronavirus. Specifically, university students have experienced a lot of change in the midst of coronavirus, specifically the way they participate in hookup culture. This raises the question of how the pandemic has impacted students' decisions to engage in hookup culture, which I will be answering in today's presentation. So the way that university students engage with casual sex is impacted by the way that they have been socialized their entire lives. Our culture has cemented the idea that gender exists in the form of a binary. This gender binary reinforces the arbitrary idea that there is a constant dichotomy between masculinity and femininity. This notion of a gender binary has become institutionalized, and now every member of our society must engage in response to it. It is helpful to think of it is helpful to consider gender as a performance. It is something people do rather than something people are, as initially described by sociologists West and Zimmerman in 1987. And since gender is a role that people play into, performing in response to gender binary-based socialization, in fact, influences the way that people engage with each other. Gender-based socialization is especially clear in the way that university students engage in hookup culture during COVID-19. And this study highlights the impact of gender-based socialization on the way that students think and behave in hookup culture during the pandemic. And this project will specifically focus on the way that male and female students have been taught to behave differently as a result of binary-based socialization and the harmful inequalities that persist because of it. So sex is definitely a personal topic, and people typically don't often talk about sex publicly. And due to the intimate nature of my topic, it was clear that in-depth interviews were the most comprehensive ways to gather data. So I interviewed 20 students at the University of Oregon to complete this study. Out of all 20, 13 students were female, 2 students were non-binary, and 5 students were male. And these interviews took place from January 2021 through April 2021, which is known at the UO as the winter quarter. Notably, these interviews occurred 10 to 12 months after the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. And in order to best answer how hookup culture at the University of Oregon has changed in response to coronavirus, I split my interview questions into 3 sections. Firstly, I had a background section for demographic purposes. Then I asked students a series of pre-COVID questions in which I asked students to consider their opinions and experiences from before the pandemic. Finally, I introduced a present pandemic section where I was asking students their perspectives at the time of the interview. And there are several main findings in the study that highlight the inequalities that have been created by gender-based socialization in the way that college students engage with hookup culture during a pandemic. So we see female students and male students responding differently to hookup culture during the pandemic. So first, female students were quicker to reduce the number of hookups that they were willing to engage in. 2/3 of female students overtly stated in their interviews that they were reducing their number of hookups in response to the pandemic. Female students discussed feelings of increased apprehension surrounding meeting new people, and specifically potential partners who they were typically meeting off dating apps. Meanwhile, no male student interviewed mentioned actively reducing hookups. Male students most often referred to hooking up during the pandemic with a risk versus reward mentality, wherein the risk is getting COVID and the reward is having sex. Ultimately, male students cited how their sex lives have remained predominantly unchanged, which is drastically different than female students reducing hookups. Additionally, female students referred to initiating a bit of a questioning phase with potential partners. Over half of female students talked about how they found themselves taking more time to get to know somebody as they observed their potential partner's COVID safety habits before actually meeting up. They would spend longer texting people and getting to know them rather than just meeting them immediately. Female students told me in detail how they had planned to meet up with someone that they had been talking to and yet quickly changed their mind when they found their potential partner did not seem to be very strict with COVID safety. On the other hand, male students did not spend the same amount of time and energy in making sure their potential partners abided to CDC guidelines and government mandates. Only one male student discussed questioning partners about COVID habits before they agreed to meet up. And even he referred to it as not something that was a determining factor, but more of a deterrent. Finally, female students displayed a certain fear of exposing other people to the virus that was simply unparalleled in male students. Female students were very aware of the fact that their decisions to engage in casual sex could result in them potentially being a COVID risk to others. Female students were very afraid of exposing the people in their lives to COVID, at least that they had demonstrated in the interview. Female students had talked about the fears of exposing their friends, their roommates, their family, and even at times their partner's family. While female students reported varying degrees of engaging in hookup culture, they were still very aware of the risk they posed by their decisions. Meanwhile, no male students mentioned that they were afraid to expose other people. Over half the male students told me that they had actually not put very much thought into hooking up during COVID, which is very different of a perspective compared to that of female students. So through understanding how female students have exerted more caution in hooking up during COVID, we now have an understanding of how hookup culture at the UO has shifted in response to the global pandemic. And this has been shaped by gender socialization. Differences in gender binary-based socialization have impacted the ways that students think, respond, and act in these situations. And we have observed that hookup culture during the pandemic looks differently for female students and male students, and it is important to consider about why. Ultimately, female students have demonstrated increased consideration, awareness, and thoughtfulness compared to male students, and this is indicative of the division of gender care work that is enforced by the gender binary. Throughout history, women have been expected to demonstrate more care work in various forms, specifically emotional and intimate labor. Placing the burden of caring on women has translated into many inequalities when considering gender. Women are taught to be constantly considering other people, while men are taught not to prioritize others, which leads to different levels in cognition and responsibility. The study has demonstrated how gender division of care translates into mainstream culture and can actively cause harm. For example, one student, who we'll call Violet, discussed how she had met a partner off of a dating app and hooked up with him. And she was dismayed to discover that afterwards that he was living with his great aunt at the time. And she had not found that out until after they had hooked up. And Violet told me how she was immediately distressed and became fearful, telling me how panicked she had become, thinking, what if I killed his great aunt? We can see the impact of gender division of care work in several forms through this interaction. Firstly, there is the fact that Violet showed more concern for her partner's relative than he did. Secondly, there is the issue of Violet's partner causing emotional pain and distress to Violet by casually mentioning that he lived with his elderly relative, which would cause her to panic about whether or not she would indirectly expose his relative through hooking up with him, not to mention the physical risk that he had posed. We see direct harm caused by potentially exposing others to coronavirus in this context, but the issue is much broader than just the pandemic. If gendered socialization impacts the division of care so blatantly in the context of a global pandemic, the impacts of this division in hookup culture should also be considered. This pattern indicates that men are exercising less cognitive consideration when it comes to considering their partners and hooking up. Even beyond the scope of COVID-19, this indicates lack of communication, awareness, consideration. This project demonstrates the direct consequences caused by gender-based socialization and how the system perpetrates inequality and harm. And the study is important because it is vital to acknowledge inequalities created and enforced by the gender binary so we can work to unlearn them. And these are some quotes I had from the interviews showing the difference in cognition between male students and female students.
All right, magnificent presentation, Danielle. Good usage of interviews to really talk about that gender division of care work and hookup culture and how COVID-19 can kind of exacerbate those inequalities. So next up we have Gracia, who's presenting queer identity as the litmus test for better consent.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. And as a quick content warning, this topic does have a lot to do with sexual violence. So I really advocate for everyone watching to take care of themselves. I'm also a privileged advocate at Sexual Assault Support Services. So if anyone needs to debrief, needs any resources, feel free to message me in any capacity because your safety and well-being comes first. Let's get this started. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Cool, glad to hear it. Okay, so this project started a couple of years ago when I was looking at CDC findings of who experienced sexual violence in different rates of sexuality categories. So I found that the CDC reported that 1 in 8 lesbian women and 1 in 6 heterosexual women experienced rape in their lifetimes. Well, that statistic jumped up pretty heavily for bisexual women, and it was about half of women or bisexual women that had experienced rape in their lifetimes. This trend kind of goes along different definitions of sexual violence. So for example, about 75% of bisexual women report experiencing other forms of sexual violence, such as harassment and unwanted sexual contact, as compared to about 43% of straight women and 46% of lesbians. I came to one of my professors kind of trying to grapple with these statistics and trying to understand why that was. And she looked at me and said, well, Gracia, bisexual women have sex with men. And so that was a really big turning point for me. I realized that multigender attracted women are uniquely positioned. Although they hold queer identities, they also have the potential to be in intimate situations with men. So that means that they both have an alternative to heterosexual sexual scripts, but there's also an out. So I was really curious about what put multigender attracted women at this higher risk for sexual violence and kind of what the driving factors were. Some research has been done on this topic before, and a lot of the research looks at environmental factors. So things like poverty, mental health, and substance use. But this really changed when I read Sexual Citizens by Seamus Khan and Jennifer Hirsch. It was a pretty groundbreaking sociological study that interviewed over 150 participants at Columbia University. And what they found was queer students at Columbia University conceptualize of consent in a fundamentally different way than their heterosexual counterparts. So this is kind of what I utilized to propel my way into this research study. So what I started out with was knowing that queer sex doesn't follow the typical narrative of men initiating women and women gatekeeping until they say yes to men. Queer sex asks lots of different questions like, what is sex? How do we initiate it? How do we define it when it's over? There's no one particular way that queer sex happens, so I wanted to know what the difference was in how they conceptualize of consent and lack thereof. So going into methods, I conducted 20 in-depth interviews lasting between 30 minutes and an hour and a half. Participants were asked to hold the following identity categories. So I asked that they were women, they were between the ages of 18 and 27, they had experienced sexual violence, and they were multigender attracted. 17 of my participants were cis women, and 3 were non-binary, but identified that they were socially perceived to be women, which is why they volunteered to be recruited and interviewed in the first place. I did identify that their experiences were unique from the cis women that I did interview, but there were a lot of overlaps in how they were perceived and how men perceived them in sexual situations. I asked around how consent worked in both intimate and daily situations, and I also asked about their experience of recognizing that they'd experienced sexual violence. I asked about how their sexuality informed their understandings of consent, especially around their relationships with men and with non-men. The language is really important here as well. I use these two categories because men structurally hold more social power over people of other genders. It's really important here not to lump non-men into the category of womanhood, so I think it's important to identify that I'm not doing that, but rather identifying how gender creates different social structures that gives certain genders more power than others. So I initially came into this research project aiming to understand whether or not multigender attracted people and people perceived as women experience sexual violence at higher rates. But this actually turned into a study about how queerness impacts our sexual scripts and how we perceive consent and lack thereof. I kept noticing that the majority of my participants would say a period of time where they wouldn't categorize their experience as sexual violence until a certain turning point. So these turning points, there were 3 major categories. The first one was sexual violence prevention education. So in looking at sexual violence prevention education, this was usually mandatory training that began at the beginning of college. And many participants identified that sexual violence prevention education wasn't particularly useful in preventing sexual violence, and it also didn't often feel relevant for their sexuality and life experience. But what was really important was providing the language for survivors to identify their experiences in experiencing sexual violence. The next huge turning point is hearing other women's stories. So many participants identified that they didn't think that they'd experienced sexual violence until they heard a friend or a colleague or a coworker or a presenter talk about their experience that mirrored their own. And that acted as a really huge turning point to identify that the language they could use could kind of create the idea that what they experienced was harmful and that it wasn't normal. The third turning point is what was really, really fascinating to me. So I found that participants really understood their experiences as sexual violence around the same time that they came to terms with their sexual orientation. So realizing that they were queer in some capacity meant that there was an alternative to the heterosexual sexual script that they assumed was the norm. I'll share a quote that I think is really fascinating with you all. One participant said, "I found that in relationships with girls, it's been much easier to say, 'Can I kiss you?' Or 'Are you comfortable with this?' Or 'How was your sexual history impacted what we're doing right now?' Or just consent opened up in general." And then in terms of boys, it's always like almost nonverbal consent, which is obviously not, I don't know, it's like so messed up, but yeah. I think about like in terms of moving towards sex with a boy, it's always just kind of like, I didn't say no, and so that means I said yes, which I know that's wrong, but that's kind of been my experience. I thought this quote was fascinating because it identified the differences in consent between men and women, but it also identified what could be different about those experiences. Another participant said, when I asked about kind of what queerness meant in terms of their understanding of consent, they said, "It's raised my standards because now, like shit that I would have put up with before from cis men, now I'm like, actually, this isn't how I want to be treated. This isn't how I want this to be going. Just my voice, my feelings, my opinions. It's definitely helped me follow through with my own boundaries." So here's where that heightened standard for consent comes in, which I think is really fascinating. Instead of kind of considering consent as something that happens non-verbally or maybe just an ongoing process that doesn't really get checked in with men, queer women have a higher standard at the point where they've had other experiences with non-men, or they've just had the realization that there's an alternative to the heterosexual sexual script that they've been conditioned into. Another quote that I thought was really fascinating was, "If I've set a boundary with a man, it'll usually get pushed a few times. Like, I expect for it to get pushed a few times, which I don't like. I would rather just set my boundary and that be respected. So I kind of expect that of men. And I don't, in my experience, a woman has never done that to me." So there's this new terrain where queer women are trying to grapple with what it means to be with people who don't follow that normalized script of social gender conditioning. So in this new terrain, I've kind of found two separate camps that people fall into. So first, participants relied on reinforcing gender norms, and they also relied on subverting them in other capacities. I'll go over the reinforcing first because I think it's really interesting. Not that the other part's also not interesting, but so first in terms of reinforcing, there was a lot of conversations surrounding participants naturalizing gender expectations of consent. So one participant mentioned, "I do feel like there are more men who don't physically check in with their partners than women. And I also feel like women tend to naturally have that strength of emotion connection anyways." And another participant mentioned, "Yeah, like honestly, I don't think any of my hookups, there was a statement like, 'Oh, do you want to do this or do you consent to that?' It was just kind of like, well, you're here, like this is what we're doing." I was fine with it because I wanted to be there too, but I don't think it's as much in the culture of the men that I've hooked up with, just like naturally. And so in these, there's a really interesting identification of men naturally being worse at consent and naturally just doing what they want to do. And as we know as sociologists, gender isn't natural. It's often something that we reinforce and kind of create through our actions, our performances, and our structures. And so here I really like to highlight that there's this normalization of gender norms and gender stereotypes that kind of gives men the leeway to do what they want to. However, there is also a lot of subverting, which is really great. So one participant mentioned, "I felt the need to be more respectful with women in the way that I wanted to be respected. And I've never really been able to have that sort of relationship power dynamic with cis men. There was definitely more of a respect and an understanding that we're complex human beings and we deserve to have the ability to say yes and no to things." So here, these participants are really grappling with the idea that they're with someone who's kind of on the same equal level as them. There's less of a power structure. This doesn't account for other power dynamics like race, class, other things like that. However, it is really fascinating to see what sex looks like when there's not a power dynamic and the power structure doesn't put men at an advantage. One last quote here that I love is one participant said, "I think especially if you're a woman-loving woman, that kind of situation, we've been societally taught not to initiate anything. And I kind of like wait for the man to initiate something. So I just think that women and non-binary folks are often just way more respectful of your boundaries." And this I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to identify why that was. And a lot of participants brought up the fact that many other women and non-binary folks had also experienced sexual violence. So there was an inherent little voice in their head asking if the other person was interested in enjoying it so that they didn't have to violate their consent in the way that they had experienced. One danger here, though, is there was an assumption that queer people and non-men in general were inherently better at consent, and that led to a big problem for some of the folks that I interviewed. Some of the people I interviewed were experienced sexual violence at the hands of other queer people, and they faced a really big problem there. First, they struggled to kind of come to terms with that because the definition of sexual violence can often be so narrow and heterosexually centered. And then second, a lot of participants identified that they didn't want to out their perpetrator solely because they didn't want to make the queer community look even worse under like a society that promotes homophobia and discrimination at large. So that's one place where I thought it was really important to identify how we can kind of create a conversation that understands how queer people make sense of consent while also leaving room for survivors to maintain justice and dignity and healing. The implications for this research, there are many, but the ones that I really want to highlight is first that sexual violence research ought to take into account acknowledgement of sexual violence versus instances of sexual violence that might not be accounted for. Because multigender attracted women are put in that unique position, they might be experiencing sexual violence at higher rates. That also begs the question of who's getting access to knowing what sexual violence is and if their experiences fit into that large definition. As I mentioned, a lot of the folks who learned that they had experienced sexual violence learned it in a college setting. So that asks us who is teaching the people who aren't going to college. In addition, there needs to be a lot better language to describe sexual violence so survivors can describe their particular experiences. Often survivors wait months and years until they acknowledge that they've experienced sexual violence, and they deserve resources and support much sooner than that. And I think that language could be a really big part of that. Lastly, even in communities that subvert gender and sexuality norms, there's still the potential for harm, right? So I think that's really important as well here, is kind of identifying how we can create change in the queer community that both acknowledges the really incredible progress that we have and also the harm that occurs. So in conclusion, there needs to be a lot more survivor support, specifically for multigender attracted people, because they have unique experiences of sexual violence that are not currently adequately addressed. And that's it from me.
Wonderful presentation, Gracia. I think your work really illustrates the importance of, vocabulary, narratives, and experiences of queerness on consent, power, and sexual violence. Also, I know there's at least one attendee whose research is on sexual violence prevention, so maybe we'll get some questions and collaborations later, who knows. So let's now turn to Claire, who is presenting the effects of imprisonment on previously incarcerated fathers in the family unit.
Okay, hey, let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah, okay, cool. So the title of my thesis is Fatherhood Behind Bars, the Effects of Imprisonment on Previously Incarcerated Fathers and the Family Unit. And so just to give a sort of introduction to incarceration within America itself, incarceration is a pretty common part of the life course in this country. 1 in 3 Black males, 1 in 6 Hispanic males, and 1 in 17 white males will go to prison during their lifetime if rates of incarceration remain unchanged. Men are also 8 times more likely to go to prison than women, and of those men, a really high percentage of them are fathers and have children. From one of my participants, he said that he would estimate in his facility, 75% of the inmates are fathers, and a lot of the other men I spoke to gave pretty similar numbers to how many men in their facilities they would assume are fathers. Incarceration is also a uniquely American issue. The United States accounts for 4 to 5% of the global population, yet holds 25% of the incarcerated population. And so I feel like this not only gives an introduction to this topic, but also sort of shows why I was interested in this in the first place. I feel like these are pretty staggering statistics. And yeah, so I conducted 10 interviews with fathers who basically the requirement was that they were incarcerated for at least a year, and that at the time of their incarceration, their child or children were under 18 years old. 9 of the interviews were on Zoom and 1 was on a phone call. But even with the age requirement that I had, for a majority of the men, their children were actually under 5 years old when they were first incarcerated, so they were very young. And it was a pretty diverse sample of men. They were ranged from California, New York, Missouri, and Oregon. I followed a semi-structured in-depth format. Each interview was about like 45 to 60 minutes, and I sort of followed a 3-fold structure. So the first part was about just basically what their life in general was like before they went to prison, and what their relationship with their child or children were like. The middle part was about what their life in prison was like, specifically what it was like in relation to the parent-child relationship and how that sort of shifted once they were incarcerated. And then the final part was normally about re-entry, coming home again, and how they sort of had to shift their relationship once coming home with their children, because for a lot of them, you know, they were in there for like 10 years. And so they are in there, they go in, their child is 2, and then they come out, they're basically a teenager. So just that was kind of the structure I followed with the interviews. So the first finding I want to highlight is about the background and sort of the communities that these men came from who I interviewed. I noticed a pattern pretty early on that a majority of the men I spoke to were pretty heavily involved with like gang activity, street activity, drug-related activity, which not only led them to go to prison in the first place, but also led to what their relationship was like before they were incarcerated. Like I said, the children were really young, so a lot of them didn't really have a super deep relationship with them because of how their life was so split between family and criminal activity. So from this one participant, he was talking about how I was dedicated to the street, so I couldn't mix the two meaning his family life and his like street life. And then he said how I basically chose the streets over my children at that point in time. And a majority of the men I talked to expressed pretty similar sentiments. So the second finding I want to highlight is how the men I spoke to described their conceptions of fatherhood before they were in prison. So a majority of them spoke about their role as a father before they were incarcerated as a pretty like heavily a provider role, which is a pretty gendered fathering style and a masculine fathering style. Most of them talked about how they thought of fatherhood as you make sure the child's supported, you make sure the mother's supported, and that's kind of it. A lot of them did still like hang out with their children, see them sometimes, but for them at that point in time, they were just really focused on the provider role. And so like this man spoke, before incarceration, my parenting style was just, you know, come in, check on you, provide money, mostly just provide money. Like I said, they were young, so I would come and hang out with them, carry them, play a little games, watch a little TV, leave money to the mother, and go on about my business. That's really what my parenting style was. That's crazy now that I think about it, but it was. And you know, like he sort of said at the end, a lot of the men did reflect on that as they were telling me about their parenting style prior to incarceration. A lot of them said how, wow, that really was what I was doing, because that kind of shows how much their fathering style has shifted since then. And so the third finding I want to highlight is how the men talked about going into prison. And they were talking about not just how difficult it was to be a father while in prison, but also just how difficult it is to be in prison because it's such a jarring environment. And so even the men who were lucky enough to get visitation and see their child maybe once a week or once a month were saying how it was great to see my child, but at the end it came with this really empty, sad feeling. And it didn't replace being physically there with their child outside of prison. And, you know, for the men who are lucky to get visitation and see their child or their children, they still all reflected that they felt that feeling. And so the bottom quote also is talking about the shock of prison itself that these men sort of described to me. And this one man was saying how it's Groundhog's Day all over again. Another man was saying how the 7 days into going into prison, he saw a man stabbed right in front of him, and that everyone was saying, like, just keep walking, don't pay attention to it. And I feel like that quote highlights how even if you are engaged in a life of gang activity, street activity before, like this man himself was, he still was very like shocked and affected by the environment of prison. And so I wanted to highlight that because I think that's important to note, that that's another part of being in prison they're struggling with, is not just trying to father and be a parent and connect to their child, but also to be like a human being in prison. Okay, so the fourth finding I want to highlight is some barriers on the inside and within prison that the men reflected upon. So a huge limitation to visitation is sort of a geographic barrier, because where men are placed really heavily depends on if it was a federal prison or a state prison, what their offense was, what level of crime was, where they are in their incarceration journey. And so men can be moved like 10 times during their period of incarceration, which makes it really difficult to for their children to visit them and see them. And another really big issue is that it costs like money to see your child, but also time. You have to have time to schedule this, to not be at work to visit the father while in prison. You also have to have money maybe to get a bus to get out there. A lot of the times most prisons are in pretty geographically rural areas, which make it even more difficult to have visitation and have connection. So a lot of the men express the difficulty of that. Like the first quote says, how his family didn't really have the means to travel, and so he didn't really get many visitations. There's also a lot of visitation rules. They keep a pretty strict environment for visitation. And so like one of the quotes says, you can touch each other, but not too much. A lot of the men said that you could kind of play, but it was still, you were being watched all the time. So you couldn't really be yourself and the children couldn't really be themselves, which obviously create a barrier toward connection. And for the men that couldn't get visits and had letter writing or video chats like this, or phone calls and stuff, that still is a barrier toward connection, because it's not the same as being face to face. And there's also just a lot of delay between those things, especially letter writing. And yeah, I'm not going to read those two other quotes. So the fifth finding and final finding I want to highlight is reentry and sort of the experiences that the men talked about coming home again. And so, like I said earlier, for a majority of men, their children were under 5 years of age when they went into prison. So, and majority of the men I spoke to were in there for at least like 6 or 7 years, I would say, was kind of the average. And so coming out, you know, they were kind of a different person, but their children were definitely different people. And as your children grow older, your parenting style also has to shift and change, and as your children change. And so there was sort of this like learning curve that the men expressed that they had to go through, but also these feelings of guilt. And so a lot of men kind of went back to like a provider role and sort of just spending money on the children so they're happy. And so it kind of alleviates the guilt of being gone for so long. And so one of the men said how I tried to always buy her toys and spoil her and give her whatever she wanted because I felt like I missed out on a lot. So I was feeling guilty. And like I was saying, like there's this whole period of getting to know each other all over again, you know, it's sort of a reintroduction. And so one of the men said how she was feeling me out, even though she had seen me on visits and stuff, she had never seen me in the real world. Once I came home, we broke the ice a little bit, and you know, now everywhere I go, she's with me. I can't get rid of her. And so from how the men I talked to reflected, it seemed like there was this kind of period of feeling each other out, getting to know each other again, sort of changing your parenting style. But then for all the men I spoke to, the parent-child bond really did strengthen over time. And as they got to become close again, they found themselves very close to each other and having a good parent-child relationship. And so this man said how, I think I was an awesome dad, to be honest. He's talking about post-incarceration. I think I was an awesome dad when I came home. I feel like I didn't want my daughter to go through what I've been through. My dad did 30 years of prison, so we didn't really have a relationship. I didn't want my kids to go through that. I wasn't really able to connect with my father. So like this participant, a lot of men did say how someone in their family had also been in prison. And so I think for a lot of them, once they came out, they realized they really didn't want this pattern to sort of keep happening, and they wanted to make the parent-child relationship as strong as possible so their children didn't end up going to prison. So for conclusions, for kind of what we know now that we didn't know before, for all the participants, as I went through the interviews, it became really clear that the fathers came from really similar backgrounds and experienced really similar barriers to connection within the parent-child relationship while they were in prison. And through talking to them as well, it became clear that incarceration and prison and like the barriers within prison itself really do negatively impact the parent-child relationship. And incarceration really severely interrupts the life course of the father, and it also really interrupts the relationship between the parent and the child. And so for the future research, I would have loved to do more interviews and just have more data and speak to more people and see how the pattern kind of does hold up when I speak to more people. And I also really recommend research on mothers who are incarcerated and how that impacts the parent-child relationship, because mothers are seen as the primary caretaker. And there really isn't any research on how mothers are directly impacted in their own feelings when taken away from their family and their child. So I think that would be really great research to see as well. But yeah.
Fantastic presentation, Claire. I really like how you untangled the relationship between parenthood and incarceration systems and how previously incarcerated fathers tried to manage those social contexts. And really outstanding work to all the presenters, so give yourself a hand as well. I know research and presenting that research can be extremely challenging, so congratulations on a job well done. So I think we have until 6:45. Is that right? So plenty of time for Q&A. Again, if attendees had any questions, make sure to list them down there at the bottom. So the first question I wanted to ask, I guess to address to all the presenters, was really what inspired, oops, sorry, that's my alarm going on. So my question is, what inspired your presentation or your research work? So what inspired your presentation or your research work?
I know for me personally, I am a huge sports fan, a huge fanatic. Coming to the University of Oregon, having like the women's basketball team be so amazing and just be so dominant within women's athletics really got me following them on social media. And as I was doing that, I was seeing these comments repeatedly come up, and I was really just wondering like why is everybody hating on them, you know? Like they're killing it, they're doing amazing, but why are they still facing this hateful this hate speech, really? So that's what made me want to look at it.
Yeah, for me, what inspired my research is I've always been very interested in gender performances and gender-based power structures. And so that was predominantly inspired by like Professor Pascoe at our university and her studies of like masculinity in high school. And so ever since then, I've been like very like interested in like hookup culture and stuff. And I figured I was very intrigued to learn like how COVID had a specific effect on hookup culture, because I feel like you hear a lot of different things. Like sometimes like people might be like bored, or they might be like too scared to hang out with people. So I feel like I was very curious to see like what that would translate into.
For me at least, I'm just interested in general in like incarceration related issues. And so when I was doing research, I noticed that there was a good amount of psychological research or like psychology research on the effects of children themselves whose parent or parents are incarcerated, but there really wasn't much research on the parent themselves, and like for mine, the fathers themselves. And so that kind of inspired my interest in my research. Yeah.
I kind of already mentioned my inspiration, but I guess my like academic inspiration is I'm really interested in kind of how people grapple with socially created binaries. So in this case, I was really fascinated by the binary of like in between or outside of the scope of straight and lesbian. And so I wanted to know what it meant to be within those binaries. And then also the kind of constructed binary of sexual violence and not sexual violence. A lot of participants identified that they really hoped that there was a way to describe like gray area experiences that didn't really fall into either of those categories for them. So my research kind of merged those two interests together.
Thank y'all. Those were great answers. It doesn't look like there's additional questions from the attendees, but I have, I guess, maybe one more question addressed to all y'all again, which is maybe, what is a common misconception that people have about your topic?
I have one. I've been thinking about this a lot because there tends to, especially in sociology, I've noticed there's like a really big bias against me search. And so a lot of people want to know like how I fit into this research. And even if that's not relevant, right? I think social science tends to have the idea that we need to be as objective as possible. And I actually think that lived experience is really, really important for research like this, especially by backing it with participant data, literature reviews, things like that. So I suppose like my common misconception is that I have to be involved or not involved in research in certain ways.
I feel like for mine, there's a big narrative that about absent fathers, and that kind of the fathers I interviewed would kind of fit like the stereotype of what an absent father would look like. But I mean, through interviewing them, like while they might have been absent before they were incarcerated, from talking to all of them now, they have really great relationships with their children, and they really do want to be and are close with their children and want to have like deep, meaningful relationships with a lot of trust and be present for their children. So I would say that is kind of a misconception.
As I was sitting here thinking, a misconception that most people might have about this topic is one that I actually had prior to even doing the research. Was I just thought it was dudes on the internet who wanted to, get their anger out towards these women. But really it became almost as society has turned so intensely political, as we can see since Donald Trump, sadly. There's just this massive political polarization that is fueling people's behaviors, be it public or online. And I didn't even assume politics was going to be a part of my research, but really it became basically the driving force of it. And I thought that was just really interesting that it's not just individuals who are kind of like women haters or women bashers. While that is definitely present, a lot of it is people feel like by these female athletes having a platform and having a voice, their politics and their identity is somewhat attacked through that.
Yeah, no, that's again, yeah, I feel like one of the most like common assumptions about like hookup culture is that like gendered experiences are inherently biological, as Gracia and I had talked a little bit about that. In reality, it's just socially ascribed phenomenon. So it's like someone's gender is like, like a performance, something they do. It's not something that they like biologically concretely are. And so I feel like that like is important to take into consideration when studying hookup culture, because there's a lot of like compulsory heteronormativity. And it's like really like important to consider like how these like boxed in like gender roles and like can be harmful and how they have an impact over the field as a whole.
Looks like we do have a couple of open questions still in the Q&A and a couple that have been answered. Claire Herbert is asking of everyone that she says, I found that while analyzing data, I often think of questions I wish I had asked in my interviews. Did any of you experience this? If so, what question or line of inquiry do you wish you had asked during your data collection?
I kind of did this while my interviews were still going on, and like the 11th interview, I was like, oh my God, like I should be asking so many more questions. So I think like a lot of my interviews got more in depth, but specifically asking, I think one of the questions that I really like wish I'd asked every single person is like, how did you approach consent? Specifically while you were coming to terms with your identity with men, and then how are you approaching consent currently? Because I think that could really provide that evolution of how they conceptualized it. Whereas right now I just have like a really stark before and a really stark after. So that kind of helped me get like a good progression throughout my research.
Yeah, I realized that I feel like there's a lot of questions that I wish I would have asked in my interviews, but I feel like, yeah, I feel like it would have been helpful for me to know more about people's like lived experience. I probably wish I would have like asked for more examples or more context, because I feel like that could have been useful in analyzing my data.
I think for me, it was kind of similar to Gracia, where I did a few interviews and then kind of like adjusted from there. But one of the questions that I started doing a little later on was asking if they wish they did anything differently while they were incarcerated in relationship to being a father and the parent-child relationship. And I feel like asking that kind of opened up to them reflecting themselves on how they did experience themselves as a father, and how their own conceptions of who they were as a father, what those were. And yeah, I thought that was a good question to start asking.
I didn't do interviews, but I would love to interview female athletes about this. That'd be a great thing to do.
All right, and there is another question in there of for everyone. Sociologists are often really great at identifying problems and forms of social stratification. You all identified some problems that we should change. What kind of solutions do you envision in response to the issue that you researched? And how do we move forward out of the constraints of our society?
For me personally, I think obviously sports news outlets really just need to start posting more about female athletes just in general. But I know that's going to be a massive overhaul in terms of like how do we keep the same, I guess, consumer base while also having proper representation. And I think that honestly just starts by simply giving female athletes a platform. Start airing games on ABC or CBS, even on ESPN. If you give the female athletes that platform, people will come. And I think this is super prevalent based on the WNBA. Based on their first, I think, few weeks, viewership has gone up 75% since last season, and it's because they're airing these games on national networks. And so I think once we start there, giving them the chance is really what we have to start doing.
Yeah, I've often I think it's really important to consider like how like powerful it is to like understand the fact that like something is an institution. So like at least for like unlearning the gender binary based socialization, I think like one of the most important steps is to like understand the grip it holds and the consequences that it provides. So I feel like how to move forward out of the constraints of society, at least at first, is to like provided with like a super comprehensive understanding of like what it means to like be like so like to have these institutionalized inequalities, and yeah, to start thinking outside of the box or outside of the constraints, outside of the binary maybe.
I feel like for mine, it's kind of twofold. I feel like one, sort of reflecting on the problem of the communities these men came from, and sort of addressing questions of why are these people, or why are these like neighborhoods and communities needing to are more inclined to commit crime, and why are they dealing drugs or doing whatever to get money. Like, what is it about those communities and helping that situation? And I think later on it's also like an incarceration issue where like kind of asking questions of, is it necessary to lock people up because of drugs for 10 years? Like, is that a necessary crime? And is that a fair crime to just take someone completely out of their life, but also out of the family? Are there other ways of dealing with the issue, or other methods for rehabilitation besides a long prison sentence or a prison sentence at all?
I think this question is really hard for me, just because like I don't know how to answer. Like, we can solve the issue while also like sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these things exist, right? Because they're predicated on those systems. But what we know right now is sexual violence prevention education is not working, and particularly for queer folks. So I would say, number one, revamp those programs, and number two, make consent a bigger conversation much sooner. I know this is Danny's interest in the future, but like implementing consent research, or just like consent programs like early on, and helping folks know that they have autonomy over their bodies at a very young age, I think would be a really good like community level step.
There was one last comment in the Q&A that I think is important to just say and highlight live, which is, this isn't a question. I am so impressed with all of your research and presentations. These are fantastic topics. You gathered interesting data, and you did a great job explaining why we need to care about these social problems. Congratulations to all of you.
Thank you.
So I think we still have a little bit of time left. Were there any questions that y'all had to one another about y'all's presentation?
I feel like we know each other's research so well at this point because we've been working with each other like every week since September. But yeah, everyone's projects have evolved a ton, and it's been really amazing to see where they ended up.
Yeah, I guess one question could be like, what did you initially think your project was going to be about, and how did it end up turning out super different?
I feel like for mine, I thought it was going to be more focused on just like the period of when they were in prison and how their relationship was with their child was then. But then through the interviews, I realized, well, it made more sense just for like conversation, but also just made more sense for context of everything to talk about before incarceration and after. And I feel like that added just a lot more knowledge to what I was talking about, and just gave a lot more insight into like who these people are as a whole, and helped me figure out patterns better as well.
I'll go. We just stare at each other the whole time, so we'll just make it fast. So two things. The first really interesting thing is I was going in kind of attempting to see whether or not those rates of sexual violence kind of matched up with the rates of violence of my participants. So I asked every single participant, did your perpetrator know that you were multigender attracted? And all but I think 3 said no, which was really fascinating because there's a lot of really interesting research about the hypersexualization of multigender attracted women and things like that. But my data kind of shows that it's about a lot more than just kind of perpetrators identifying queer women that they can harm in some capacity. So that was one really big thing. I also thought it would be really hard to recruit participants because it's such a niche group of folks, but I had like an outpouring of participants, which was really wild. I had more people than I had money to interview, which was really, really great, but also showed like how stark of a problem this is, and how little it's kind of identified in sexual violence prevention work.
Yeah, I honestly think I was just incredibly shocked by how hateful the things I found online were. Because I had seen some of the things like, oh, get back in the kitchen, that sort of deal. And I was like, okay, I'm expecting to see that. But once I did like a deeper dive, I was amazed people could even be allowed to post these things on the internet and not get, flagged in some way. Because so much of it was just so hateful, and especially Naomi Osaka really got the brunt of it all, especially because she's Black, Japanese, and a woman. And so it was really interesting to see how whenever there was if her name was simply mentioned, people would just lose their minds over it. And I thought that was really interesting because I guess I really thought I had looked at the issue pretty broadly, but once I did my research, I realized I was like, okay, I only saw this as a surface level issue initially, and doing this research really just opened up a whole world of crazy stuff on the internet that I was so unaware of.
No, Gracia, it's funny that you said that you had such an easy time recruiting participants, because something I was super surprised about is how hard it was for me to talk to students about hookup culture, especially male students. I had such a difficult time recruiting male students, and I had to get super creative. So I guess something I was super surprised is how students, I guess, still like reacted to like talking about hookup culture in general. I was also surprised because I didn't really think that students would be reducing hookups, or at least I didn't really think that female students would like show that like systemically. And at the same time, I was also really surprised by male students so overtly being kind of like disregarding COVID restrictions. So I think I was surprised by both results, interestingly.
There is one more question in the chat or in the Q&A that is for Mackenzie. Claire says, I apologize if you said this before, but were the comments you analyzed anonymous on the web?
So yes and no. So these individuals had anonymity. They could put kind of whatever handle they wanted to or whatever kind of picture. But a lot of the time, these people were just posting from their own personal accounts. Like I could look at their name, find them on Facebook and, you know, call them out if I wanted to, but obviously I didn't. So yeah, it was pretty shocking to see like how just openly and blatantly these people would say these things. And while the more nastier ones were more anonymous, like they wouldn't have a profile picture and they would just have like numbers and letters as their Twitter handle. Some of the more, I guess, tame but still really terrible things were said by people who just put all their information out there, like they had their location and their age and everything. So it was shocking to see kind of the array of anonymity.
And another question for Danielle. Did you ask about the frequency of hookups before the pandemic, like a monthly rate? I'm curious to know if some versions of Sex Drive would impact how people made their cost-benefit analysis of hooking up.
Yeah, so I didn't actually ask about the frequency of hookups because I figured that was something that might be difficult to quantify. And I figured a lot of students might not necessarily have the most like concrete memory of each of their hookups. So I asked, I asked if they felt an increased desire to hook up or more apprehensive about hooking up. And I asked them to give or to sorry, I asked them about a hookup that they had experienced pre-pandemic and how they had met and what they had thought and how that had went. And then I asked them about hookup during the pandemic. And then I asked them about like their sex drive, if they'd felt like it was increased or lowering. And like I asked, yeah, I basically asked like what they felt contributed to that. And yeah, so I didn't ask about the frequency specifically because yeah, I thought that would be too difficult to answer. But yeah, I didn't ask for concrete numbers actually, but I just asked if like they were like it was more or less frequent.
If anything, I'm really proud of you guys. We all did a really great job, especially seeing your projects back in September to now. It's just incredible to see how we've all grown as researchers and just like people throughout all this. Yeah, that it's just so amazing. And I'm so proud of you guys. And I'm so happy to be able to do this with you all. And thank you to Myra and Jacy for doing all this. I appreciate you guys.
I feel the same. And I know, I feel like we've come such a long way because the stage of everything was just so exploratory. And like, what if in the beginning, I feel like all of fall term, even a lot of winter term, I feel like. So it's really great to see how this has become such a like substantial thing for all of us. And yeah, I just think it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say it again. Y'all did a really fantastic job, and it was really great work. And I'm really grateful to be moderating, I guess, this to have moderated this session. So thank y'all.
And there's one last question in the chat before her phone dies. She says, has this motivated you to do more research or deterred you?
I can say it's definitely made me want to do more research. Like I said earlier, I didn't do interviews, but oh my God, if I did interviews of female athletes, I would just love to get to hear what they thought about it. And yeah, and like I said in my presentation, like looking at other forms of social media would be really interesting based on like what their like target age is. It would be interesting to see if like on TikTok, they're way more accepting and there's less, hate speech. And looking at Facebook, oh my God, it's probably full of hate speech because it's mainly used by older individuals. So yeah, it's definitely spurred me to want to do so much more, and definitely has not deterred me.
Yeah, no, it's also definitely kind of inspired me a lot. It's so funny, while I was working on like my thesis with my advisor, she kept being like, okay, you have to like focus like on like because when you do interviews, you get like so much like information. Like I could have written like 5 different projects, but yeah, so definitely a lot more inspired, definitely excited to see what how it's going to go next time for next project or next research project.
Yeah, I definitely felt super encouraged and motivated to do more research. I loved the interview process so much. Like, I really like doing interviews, and I would have loved to interview so many more fathers. And also, I think it'd be so interesting to interview fathers who are currently incarcerated. Like I said, I think it'd be really interesting to do this whole thing with mothers. Yeah, I really like doing interviews, and the whole process itself is really great.
I think it's both encouraged me and also kind of helped me think about different ways to do research. A lot of people who are survivors don't have a lot of support systems. So often I was the first person they were telling their story to. And when you do like 5-hour-long interviews of like disclosures of sexual violence, it can be pretty exhausting. So definitely excited for like grad school when it can take multiple years to go through interviews and things like that. But yeah, I feel like I could have written a book about the research I got from this. So definitely looking forward to the future.
So maybe I guess maybe I have one more question, which is what helped you most in the project? Was there anything that you found particularly helpful, or anything like that?
This kind of goes off of my last answer, but I contacted a lot of professors who did research on sexual violence and just asked them like how they did it, and what they did to take care of themselves, and also kind of how they removed themselves from their work, because it can be a lot to kind of take on so many disclosures. And that was really, really helpful hearing from like seasoned professionals who have done this for their whole like academic career. So that was definitely like a really helpful thing I did during my research.
Would you be able to repeat the question?
Oh yes, sorry about that. I was just asking, what is the most helpful or what helped you most in your research project? We just, I don't know, maybe coping strategies, maybe things you did that helped you get, just get through it and things like that. I don't know.
I know for me personally, like having to constantly just read all of this just like hate all day was like super taxing, like emotionally. And because of that, I mean, Danny and Gracia probably have heard so much of it. I'd just like text them and be like, oh my God, look at what I just saw, and that kind of helped me, like being able to just kind of like show people and not feel like I'm having to keep all of this in until I like write my research was really helpful, just to kind of like have that outlet, because I feel like if I just kept taking in all that hate, it would just kind of ruin me as a human. So thank you, Gracia and Danny, for being there for me.
Yeah, no, I think it can be hard when people are like definitely like kind of going on or talking about heavy topics or literally spewing out hate. But something that helped me was the Otter app, because it converts like audio to text. So like it would like automatically giving it subtitles, and that saved me having to transcribe 20 like interviews and hundreds of pages. So the Otter app was what I found most useful.
Yeah, I feel like I kind of, it's like an ad for Otter, but like, yeah, as some of the people here know, I had such a hard time with the transcription process. But Otter is very helpful because hour-long interviews are, it's just so many words. And like, it also was really helpful, I feel like, to do, I don't know the term for it, but where you don't fully transcribe something, you just do like highlights. That was really helpful for me because I just had a lot of transcription issues doing this, but yeah.
Thank you all for those answers. Now I got to go download Otter, see what the hubbub is about. So we got 4 more minutes, and I don't think we have additional questions. So Jacy, is there anything?
There's nothing in the chat. I think we are good to end it here if we want to. So thank you everyone for presenting, and congratulations. You completed your undergraduate research symposium presentation. Hooray. And have a wonderful day.
Thank you. And thank you guys for moderating. Is that the word? Yeah. And yeah, it was great. Thanks.
Bye.